Today we're at the AECB conference and we are learning all about retrofit.
We've got 160 people here.
So it can be a real melting pot of shared ideas.
New technologies, new methodologies.
Help encourage each other.
Some amazing policy changes.
It's about learning. It's for people that really care and want to really decarbonise.
So to kick us off today, we've got Rachael Owens from the National Retrofit Hub. We're very grateful that she's come along. We are at the AECB are supporters of the National Retrofit Hub. She's going to sort of set the scene for us. She's going to be talking about retrofit, the landscape of retrofit today. So she's going to kick us off, and then what we'll be doing will be followed up by a deep dive into one of the AECB retrofits. But she's going to set the scene for us. So please welcome Rachael.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So I'm Rachael Owens. I'm co-director of the National Retrofit Hub. AECB are one of our partners. I'm also head of sustainability at a practice, an architecture practice, Buckley Gray Yeoman, and we're an AECB member practice. So very engaged with the AECB and love the work that they do. I'm going to talk a bit about what the National Retrofit Hub is. I know many of you are already engaged. I'm going to talk a bit about what we're doing across the sector, zoom into some of the more systemic impacts of poorly performing homes, and then I'm going to focus on a specific project that we're doing. And because it's the AECB conference, we wanted to release a new resource here today. It's going to be formally launched on Monday, so you're all getting early access and a sneak peek, so hopefully that goes down well. The National Retrofit Hub we're a not-for-profit collaborative organisation. We're a really small internal team with a big, growing, really activated network, and we want to enable the local delivery of retrofit at scale. We see ourselves as a collaborator. Our role is to really bring together everyone working in the space so that they can collectively overcome some of the known challenges to retrofit that we face. And our job within all of that is to facilitate really good conversation, make sure that we can support people to form consensuses, and we do that in a number of different ways. I think that you all know this, but we see the value of retrofit as more than just reducing emissions, incredibly important though that is. It's also about reducing energy bills, reducing fuel poverty, improving our energy security, but also creating comfortable, healthy homes. And if we do this in the right way, we can also achieve lots of new jobs, growth and innovation, but specifically in local areas that need it most. So one of the ways that we work is through our 6 different working groups. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of them all here because they're all open for you to join. If I say anything that sounds like it would be interesting to you that you want to get involved in, you can go on our website, you can join our working groups, and I know many of you are already engaged. So working group 1 is really looking at how do you decide what to do to a building, what are the relevant standards out there, how do you make those design decisions, but how do you do it at scale in a way that improves the quality of what we're delivering. So that group's looking at things like archetyping, digital building logbooks, and quality assurance processes. Working group 2 is looking at supply chain, products and solutions. So they're really interested in delivering a solution agnostic approach. So that means making people aware, like this centre does, of the wide selection of products, solutions, technologies that are out there, so that we're not just doing business as usual, but we're using the right solution to achieve the outcomes we need. They're also about to start some work on supply chain barriers and how to overcome them in the retrofit sector. So if that's one of your interests, now would be a good time to get in touch. Working group 3 is looking at workforce growth and skills. We obviously need a lot more people working in the retrofit sector if we're going to deliver what we need to. So they're looking at things like how to bring more people into the sector, what different skills are needed, what training courses look like, occupational standards, and also the role that public procurement can play and social value in creating more upskilling in the industry. Working group 4 is on finance. That one we're working with the Green Finance Institute and Bankers for Net Zero. And we've held some meetings at the start of the year looking at things like what happens if you embed financial offers in retrofit delivery. And we featured some of the Green Homes Finance Accelerator projects, some of which are in the room here. We've also looked a little bit at the Net Zero Neighbourhoods approach using blended financial models. And the project that we're currently mostly looking at in that group is on EPC reform. We're looking at what the whole sector needs from EPC reform, but also specifically what the finance industry needs. And we're hoping to release a report on that by mid-October before the anticipated EPC reform consultation, which we've been told is coming shortly. But we think it's going to come in the next few months. Working Group 5 is on delivery approaches. So this one, we really started by trying to map the resident journey across retrofit and trying to understand how different delivery models like SHGF, like grant funded, like owner-occupier able to pay sector, like one-stop shops work across that journey. And we've also identified through lots of workshops with people who are delivering retrofit where the challenges are in that sector. We've identified 3 key areas that we're starting to work on. One's on engagement, another one's on measuring outcomes, and a third is on planning policy. We've also recently released a report with all of those findings, but the report also includes a bit of the state of the nation, what's actually being delivered right now in terms of retrofit and how much do we need to scale up. And I'm going to show you some of those insights in a minute. And then finally, working group 6 is on driving uptake. This is fundamentally about how do we get people to want the work that you guys all do, because we really need demand in order to stimulate this part of the industry. So they're actually looking at a literature review at the moment of all of the existing research on what are the attitudes, the awarenesses around decarbonisation and the energy efficiency of our homes. So I'm going to sort of zoom out a little bit, talk a little bit about the sort of full cost of poorly performing buildings, because we know that the vast majority of homes in the UK are going to need to be improved in some way if we're going to protect residents from fuel poverty, from the threats associated with climate change, from health and well-being problems, from damp, mould, cold and overheating, and energy insecurity. You've probably seen these figures many times, but the BRE estimates that poorly performing homes cost the NHS £1.4 billion a year, and the full cost of society is £18.5 billion a year. So obviously it's a huge economic impact, but also these people's lives that we're talking about. Dark Matter Labs did some really interesting research on this, specifically in the Birmingham area, and they took the impacts of an underperforming home, tried to understand how that impacts the people that use these buildings, use these homes, live in them, and then understood where all of the knock-on impacts were to different organisations, different parts of local government, and then finally to national government. And they found that the sort of ripple effect from these underperforming homes was huge. But this also means that there's a big win here if we can get this right. We can actually make cost savings for all of these government departments that are already really strapped for cash. And we know lots of households are living in fuel poverty. Depending on which indicator you use, it's either 13.4% or somewhere between 30 and 45% of households that are spending way too much of their income on energy use. And you're all probably aware of this, but I think it's really key to sort of set this out to make sure that we're always having this in the back of our minds, that we're thinking about people's lives. I also think it's more important that we start talking about overheating. So by 2070, the summers that we experienced in 2022 will happen every other year in London. I don't know if you remember that, but it was 40 degrees off and it didn't cool down at night. It was really hard to cool down our homes to live. And there are currently about 170 excess deaths attributable to heat just in London alone each year. And the reason why this is really fundamentally important that we tackle is because heat affects people differently and it actually exacerbates existing inequalities. So heat stressors might be things like age. So older people, those who are babies and children, they're less able to thermoregulate. Those with mental health conditions are both at an increased risk of health issues due to heat, but also that heat can make their existing symptoms worse. If they are living in poor housing quality, in a small, single aspect flat and smaller dwellings with less outdoor space, you're much more likely to be impacted. And if you're living in urban areas, in 2003, there was a heat wave in the West Midlands, and the urban heat island effect was estimated to account for about 50% of all heat-related deaths. So what we're seeing here is that the impact of poorly performing homes aren't spread across the country equally, they're exacerbating existing inequalities. And we're living in a society that is becoming more and more unequal. The proportion of the income that the richest 1% of the UK earns is getting higher, which means those who are in fuel poverty, those who are experiencing these issues, are experiencing them more dramatically. I really like one of the ways that Kate Raworth thinks about this in donor economics. What she suggests is that we should move away from divisive ways of doing things, where you capture opportunity and value in the hands of the few, into more distributive ways of working, where we share opportunity and value with all of those who co-create it. And the reason why I talk about this is because retrofit at scale is a huge prize. It's a massive industry. So all of us that are working in it need to make sure, are we doing this in a way that is going to cement value in those local communities, in those areas where it's really needed, or are we doing it in a way where the value is being extracted and externalized? And I think We were talking last night about the Grenfell report that was released, and one of the things that really struck me about it is that the community groups are the only people that came across well in it. They were the only organisations who actually did something really positive. They got out there, they supported those who needed the help most in their time of need. They were able to mobilise quickly. They didn't have massive financial incentives to do any of this work. They were the ones that really helped in the situation. So I think we're looking more and more at the Hub about how we can support community groups to be enabled to do this work, because we think that's a really powerful way of making sure that value stays with the community. So before I move on to a sort of specific project, I also wanted to talk a bit about why are people not engaging necessarily with this at scale. So Which did a study, I think it was the start of this year, last year, that said 46% of UK homeowners had not investigated insulating their homes in the last 5 years and are not considering doing this in the future. So I wondered if anyone wanted to have a guess. What's the most common reason that people gave for not investigating this? Does anyone have any ideas? Do you want to shout over there? Lost on a junk? Bingo. They already thought their homes performed well enough. But of those same people, a large proportion of them were also still concerned about their energy bills and keeping their homes warm. So there's this fundamental disconnect in people's minds between their health, their well-being and their bills and the performance of their homes. And it's because we've got used to just what's not good enough, really. So there's a big job that we need to do as an industry to sort of shift this mindset, to sort of let people know you should be able to expect more from your homes. And I think we're going to hear some great projects today that are really shifting that needle, that are showing what the value of a really well-performing, comfortable home is. So I think you're all playing a big role in making this shift happen. So I mentioned in Working Group 5, we've been looking at the scale and pace of retrofit delivery. And we use the EPCC target. The government set a target for EPCC for domestic projects by 20 properties by 2035. Lots of conversations about whether that's the right target. We probably don't need to go much further than that, but that's what we had. If you bear that in mind, there's 14 million households requiring retrofit in the UK. In England, that looks like 11.8 million. That's the green bubble here. This is our retrofit Death Star. The white is the measures that we know that have been delivered through ECO and other schemes like that, those measures that get recorded. We don't know what the measures were necessarily, but they're some of the measures that were delivered. But we know that in the orange, lots of those were just boiler replacements. So what you can see here is we've got a very long way to go before we're doing anywhere near the scale and pace of retrofit that we need to, even to get to this government target that probably all of us think is not good enough. What that means is that we need to increase delivery rates of retrofit by 6-fold by 2035. So that's huge. So we're talking about a systemic change in the way that we retrofit our homes. And we've identified some things that are needed to make that systemic change happen. There's more than this, but these sort of link to the output that I'm going to be talking about. So we need better access to data and more information on our homes. We need to know that we're making the right decisions with the right impact. So the recent launch of the UK Net Zero carbon building standard, I think, is going to be fundamental in helping to make some of these big decisions, but also collecting that information on the specific homes and having it more accessible is going to be really important. We need better project pipeline certainty for supply chain and skills, which will enable investment and growth. That's both going to be triggered by increasing resident demand, but also more government stability on policies. We need better methodologies to meet funding and finance requirements, very much linked to EPC reform there. The banks need to understand that they're getting the thing that they're paying for when they're giving a discounted mortgage rate, when they're giving green finance. And we also need more streamlined abilities for people to bid for work or bid for projects. Project aggregation is going to be key, so creating efficiencies of scale, making sure we can deliver more together, more collectively, more at a community basis, making sure that we can reduce costs in that way. And public engagement and information, empowering homeowners and community groups are going to be fundamental. So one of the ways that we've been looking at this is through the role of archetyping. Any of you that have come to our Working Group 1 meetings in the last year will know that this has been a controversial topic. I must say at the start, this has really been accumulation of the work that's done by our Working Group chairs, Dr. Afan Khan and Lizzie Westmacott, our Working Group 1 members. We've also been engaging with London councils and lots of practitioners who have done archetyping for many different clients. So it's been a big joint effort. So if you don't know what archetyping is, it's the idea that you can have groups of buildings that share similar features and are likelihood to require similar interventions to make them low energy, low carbon, climate resilient and healthy. I should also mention Toby, who's in the audience here today, who I didn't mention just then. just over there. He was a big part of some of this work, and he will know how difficult it was to try and reach some sort of consensus on what the right strategy here was. So why archetype? Because I think lots of people in our groups were going, we don't want to archetype, every building is different, and I'll get to that. But there are really, really big benefits to being able to use archetyping for different types of people. It gives you a quick understanding of a building stock. Say you're a social housing provider, you want to understand your building stock quickly, it's really useful. It can give you an accessible start to planning retrofit projects. So say you want to bid for an SHGF fund, it's really useful to be able to understand what you might want to do to different types of buildings in your stock. It can help with project aggregation, identifying similar buildings, those with similar retrofit plans, so you can do works together. It can also help you collaborate. So say different local authorities have shared archetypes, it means that it enables them to work together to say, I think we need to do some research around this detail on this archetype and how we can make this risk-free. You can work together because you know that you share those buildings. It also provides really useful information for householders, giving them more engagement beyond an EPC. In that WITCH study, lots of people said they wanted to know more specifically about their own homes. So this is a good way in there. It could also inform supply chain forecasting. If we have enough information on what retrofit is needed across the country, then we can understand what materials are needed. They could also help us store knowledge, store known risks on a lesson learned on an archetype by archetype basis. If we can develop some sort of library and people can say, well, I've worked on a 1930s Victorian, there's too many different eras, a 1930s semi, and I found that there are these specific problems, and I think that they're related to that typology. I want to record them somewhere so other people working on that know that as well. We can also understand patterns within the existing stock model data. One of the conversations that we often had with academics was, yes, but we've got all this stock model data and we understand everything about all of these buildings, but you have to be a very, very technical person to be able to drill down into that data without having a tool to be able to sort of see the patterns, interpret what is actually going on in the data. So there's sort of an interface for people like you and me that maybe don't want to do large amounts of data analysis. I'm sure some of you in the room do data analysis, but I don't. Also, why archetype? When we did a knowledge centre survey last year, the number one thing that people wanted was example retrofit plans on housing archetypes. So there's demand for it as well. So our working group was really cautious. The weaknesses that they addressed, they identified were every home's different. It's really difficult to optimize the number and size of the segment. How many archetypes? There could be 10, there could be 30, there could be 1,000. Different users need different things. So one categorization might work really well for engaging people at a high level, but it won't work very well for a local authority who's trying to plan projects. Changes to buildings are not picked up always. So if you've got extensions to a similar archetype, you might want to treat them quite differently. The risks associated are things like, what if people take this archetype guidance, interpret it as a complete solution, and apply it like a retrofit plan? We obviously don't want that happening. They might overlook communal procurement, e.g. district heating. They might overlook the condition and maintenance issues. They might overlook heritage. There's also a design liability associated. If you're producing archetype guidance, you need to be able to caveat that and say, please don't use this as a retrofit plan, use your judgment. And they're also relying on the quality of the data. If we're saying, okay, I've got a specific stock and I've got this amount of data on it, what if the data is not very accurate? Our working group chair, Asan, did some research with his other hat on, and he found across one row of streets, houses that were basically built within 3 to 5 years of one another. The EPC difference in age between the oldest recorded and the youngest recorded was 70 years. So the data isn't always particularly accurate. They need some sort of checking. But we think that there are ways to overcome these risks because we think the benefit of archetyping to lots of people is worth it. So we think it's really important that the use case for the archetype is determined. So you're going to archetype based on what your client or what you need from that stock. You're going to choose characteristics that mean that you can use the archetyping in the way that you need to. And you're also going to use that use case to set the scope and level of detail. The archetype itself should include known risks about the property type. Let's use those risks and transform them into opportunities for this methodology. They specifically should include outcomes targeted. Not every client is going to have the same outcome. Those delivering SHGF projects are going to need to achieve EPCC, but many of you are going to be targeting things like net zero or specific health and comfort factors. And there needs to be links between suggested measures. We need to make sure that we're linking ventilation, for example, when we're including anything that improves air tightness. We also think that the methodology needs to be future-proof, so there's a lot of opportunity here to make sure that when we're doing this work, we're also connecting with data and stock model interoperability so that the information we're producing can then be overlaid with information that we have on homes at a larger level. There's a potential for connections with digital building logbooks, and we've done initial research on what they could look like for retrofit, and we have a resource about them on our website. And they probably could inform thinking on EPCs and data access, particularly around those outcomes. So I'm going to take you through a few examples of archetyping that other people have done, and then I'm going to tell you about the resource we've just published. So this is really to show you that for different use cases, you might do things in quite different ways. So Tune, Raft and Parity worked with London councils to produce a Retrofit London Housing Action Plan. And they characterised the housing stock quite broadly across 8 different archetypes. And the idea here is that they wanted to see where each archetypes were appearing most, what was dominating the housing stock, and specifically where local authorities shared similar archetypes so that they could develop opportunities for collaboration. They identified that there are really specific archetypes you can see on the previous slide that had the most homes within them, so they knew where they needed to focus most of all. We're working with them to develop this thinking a bit more so that they can use more detailed archetypes to help those local authorities inform their SHDF bidding, giving them more streamlined processes. A very different use case, FCBS Studio produced a really lovely guide, the Devon Retrofit Guide. This was to specifically engage householders and smaller builders. And what they did is start with quite a big overview on what you should consider on all of your retrofit projects. They did really great descriptions about energy in and energy out and how a building works. And then they used archetyping for specific building types that are quite common in Devon but aren't common across the rest of the country, so that they could explore key junction details. And they've got these really nice pattern book details in there to try and help those small builders who might be working on an extension be able to say to a client, well, your building is quite similar to this archetype. Why don't we look at incorporating some of these measures as well? Kawaki Civic Carson, Additional Studios and XCO2 also produced this retrofit social housing guide. So they've done quite a lot of work on retrofit for social housing providers already. And they found that they were developing quite similar solutions. So they produced this guide with a number of different archetypes and case studies. They define the archetype. They go into quite a lot of detail on proposed measures and interventions. They've got some lovely schematic details. And they also include estimated performance improvements, which can be really useful as well for these local authorities when they're trying to bid into these schemes to understand, okay, what am I going to be able to achieve at really high level and how can I sort of pitch that to whatever funding I'm applying for. In a different way, Tutored worked for the City of London Corporation, and they archetyped actually by some building features, but also some retrofit measures. So they were looking at, you can see at the top here, so you've got traditional but external wall insulation and traditional but internal wall insulation. So they were already thinking about the retrofit measures when they categorised. And this is a more sort of solution-led approach to archetyping, which is possible if you've got a really defined stock and you want to instantly turn it into planners with defined measures. They explored heating type PV measures and the energy and carbon trajectories for each of these different types of building. And another one that Tutored worked on, they've done a lot of work in this space and they've often used different techniques depending on the client's need. Cornwall Housing Decarbonisation Strategy. Cornwall were mostly concerned about how they decarbonise their domestic building stock. So what they did here was archetype by heat pump readiness, and then had a scale of like how much work was needed to each of these buildings to make them what they had determined to be heat pump ready. And they use quite a lot of ranges and parameters to test different approaches to different buildings, but give Cornwall a sort of overview of how they might decarbonise at scale. And finally, Energy Sprong are also looking at archetyping. They have created archetypes for homes where more industrialised processes, those modern methods of construction are more useful. They're using this for developing projects, for costing, for those early planning stages, and they're creating variants within each archetype. This is part of their Transformer project, where they're doing a lot of innovation with lots of partners on how to do sort of more portfolio level analysis, cataloguing, solution matching, linking to finance and insurance. And they're finding that that's been really useful for them to sort of understand that early planning. So in all of this, what's the role of the NRH? I think when I first started in my role a year ago, there was calls, people were saying, why didn't the NRH just produce some archetype guidance? And we very quickly got very overwhelmed and went, but we could produce hundreds and there's like 3 of us, so no. But I think people are already producing so much good stuff out there. What we wanted to do was host a library of all the stuff that's already publicly available. We wanted to help set best practice for those producing archetypes. We did agree with the group that there were risks of doing this wrong. So we wanted to make sure that we were supporting people to do it in a positive way. We also want to collaborate and convene on data interoperability, which is something we're planning in the future, and considering links to EPCs, digital building logbooks, and how all the data we're producing can sit and lie together. So on Monday, and you can get it here now, and there's a QR code, it will come up in a bit again as well. We're launching this resource, the library and the best practice guide. These are just a few pages from the guide. It's got more than this, but I just want to take you through a few key things. So one of the things that we've included is how you might start to archetype depending on your use case. So we've got some use case examples, which are written in a sort of easy to follow way, saying, Hazel's an architect working for an SHDF. Working for a social housing provider who wants to bid into SHDF, and she has used these different methodologies because that's the way that she could get to this point. We've mapped out what different characteristics you might want to choose from, and these intentionally map onto some of the work that we've been doing on digital building logbooks. So for example, if you know these things about an archetype, you could also potentially know these things about home, and you might be able to use a digital building logbook eventually to identify what the archetype that goes with it is. We've included information on what the contents of the guidance should be. So there's 3 main sections. The building information. It's really important that you provide really good information about what the archetype actually is so that people don't misidentify it and they can understand what characteristics you've used. The target outcomes is key. This is something that came up when we were working with London councils, that depending on your client and your need, you're going to be targeting different things. For example, Cornwall targeting decarbonisation, whereas some social housing providers are going to be targeting fuel poverty. And then suggested measures. So we've provided some guidance on how you should talk about those measures that you're suggesting for each archetype. And this is what each section looked like. There's a sort of checklist of what you should always include, and there's information you could include. This has sort of come about through a lot of engagement with people who are already producing these guides. But things like when you're providing information on the building type, explaining how the typology traditionally deals with ventilation and moisture, using these as a bit of an upskilling tool. Identifying likely areas requiring maintenance and repair, really important, especially when we're dealing with historic buildings, because those things really impact their performance. The key risks inherent with the archetype, the heritage and planning constraints, the overheating and flood risk, very key considering what we were talking about earlier, and any assumptions or generalizations. You might be working in Devon, and that's going to be that same building looking in the same way is going to be treated quite differently if it's in Scotland. So you need to include those. These are also the guidance for what you should include when you're talking about measures. So one of the key things that came out of our consultation on this was that people wanted to see a diagram or a section showing the basic intent of where should be warm and heated, where the air tightness layer should be, some really clear, straightforward diagrams. Thinking about embodied carbon for each measure we thought was important. It doesn't have to be a whole life carbon assessment going into this, but we at least want people to be considering, if you use this material, you might be able to do this in a lower carbon way than if you use this material. Commentary on connected measures, commentary on incompatible measures, but specifically estimates for energy demand reductions, peak energy demand reductions, and carbon emissions reductions, including embodied carbon, so that you've got a way to compare different solutions with one another. And then this is the library. So this has got the guides that we're aware of that are publicly available on different archetypes. Some of them are the ones that I talked through today, and there's some more on there. If you've produced any archetyping that is publicly available, send me an email and I'll get it added to this. If you've produced any archetyping that's not publicly available, the guide includes a little bit of information on Creative Commons licensing, and we would really encourage you to make work that you've already done work for everyone. I should have said at the start, and I've got only a few more minutes left to talk, there will be time for questions, so think about questions in this next minute. So you can scan this QR code, you can download those resources and look at the library today. We'll be sending an email out to all of our newsletter subscribers on Monday with that as well. So if you don't manage to get it, it's there on our website on our Knowledge Library. And while you're on the Knowledge Hub, make sure you have a look at the other resources that we're bringing out there. So please do go on our website. You can sign up to our newsletter there. All of these things that we publish come out on that newsletter. Get in touch if you want to get involved in any of our projects. And thank you very much.
Hi, Rachel. Can you show the slide earlier that showing sort of such a thing that it might look at as we were doing putting information for archetypes?
This one? Yeah.
Did you have any thoughts about retrofit assessment and where that might fit in the retrofit assessment process?
Yeah, this is a very good point. And actually, maybe we should have made this more specific. But in our digital building logbooks work, we sort of see this sort of specific building information part to be where a lot of the retrofit assessment goes. But actually, quite a lot of this would be contained within the retrofit assessment, wouldn't it? So maybe there's an additional piece of work to understand how the archetype then maps to that, because I think that's actually quite a tricky stage, isn't it? So that you don't want to rely too much on the generalizations in the archetype, but you want to be able to use some of the contents of that to produce the assessment.
I wonder if you can sort of see, say, when you have this initial stage, and then when you get to context, you have a detailed assessment.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. So yeah, I think that's worth testing on that. And I know that there's the new British Standard on retrofit assessments that's come out. So I think it's worth doing some work on how those two things work together. Yeah, great.
Hi, Jo Sardi. I'm an architect, and I had cavity wall insulation put in my Victorian building, UPVC plastic double glazed windows, no trickle vents. We recently sealed all the way around the UPVC frames because they had been fitted really badly 10 years ago. And I had black mould inside my walls now. So I had it tested recently, and I assumed it was the cavity wall insulation failing. And it's not, it's the ventilation. So I just wondered where ventilation, because I hadn't seen any mention of how important it was.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a situation where, what's your name again, sorry?
Jo Sardi.
Jo Sardi has had a retrofit of her home done, cavity wall insulation, new UPVC windows but no trickle vent, new ceiling around the trickle vent, having mould happening inside, and it's because the ventilation rates aren't high enough. It's a really, really important one that whenever we're doing work to improve the air tightness of our buildings, we're also incorporating ventilation. So one of the slides that isn't shown is in our guide, when you go on suggested measures, there's like a very big graphic that says 5 things, and one of them is ventilation. So that's included there, but we're also talking about how the typology typically deals with ventilation and moisture and the key unintended consequences associated with retrofitting the typology. So that's really making sure that people understand how the building currently ventilates to make sure that any measures that they suggest also either keep current ventilation or improve ventilation in a different way. But yeah, I think that is really, really important.
There was a Classic House paper just published recently about how mechanical ventilation heat recovery can be used when you've got an air tightness over 3. And that might be more important than insulating in terms of energy efficiency and health.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with what you're saying, and yeah, that's definitely one of our messages, is that ventilation is key. And yeah, there's definitely pages within the report where ventilation is put sort of front and centre. Yeah, it's a really good point. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there a value in promoting planned maintenance, not just for large-scale landlords, but also for individuals? My experience, which probably isn't, I'm not alone in this, is you have friends and family, and people in this housing market, individuals, leave things to the last minute, and then suddenly the roof's gone and it's too late to do anything fancy as they see it. So we just get a builder and we need one quick, and they just do a replacement. So that's the question about the role of that. And if we can promote that culturally, that you think ahead, and I've been promoting it, basically worrying my daughter you're going to need to spend some money on your roof. And in terms of larger scale jobs, then it's a massive opportunity, because if you can plan for it, then you can retrofit at the same time, at least 1 or 2 measures which may be compatible. The other thing was on the variations. When we were doing social housing retrofit, we developed a variation schedule. So you don't have to have 150 archetypes necessarily, but you do have variations within each type, and that people go round. Ideally, it's the actual contractors, because they will then get to know people in detail as well. It's a social engagement opportunity, as well as finding out all the little weird things that people have done or that have been done.
Yeah, very much agree. I think there's opportunities at both scales. I was talking to one local authority that provides social housing, who was saying that they were actually being able to utilise their asset maintenance budgets to do quite a lot of this retrofit work. They were finding it combining that with SHDF funding, or doing it in addition to SHDF funding, or even instead of, because it was an opportunity for them to get into the home and better sort of tie up all of these things together. And I think they're doing a little bit of work, this is Enfield, on how you can incorporate retrofit measures when you're doing the repair and maintenance. So I think at that scale, really big win, because there are budgets there for that. And yeah, very much agree at the domestic scale as well. Historic England's got some really good guidance on that repair and maintenance side when you're looking at more historic buildings. It has a massive impact. Like, I think a wet wall performs sometimes, a third worse than a wall that's not moist. So there's a definite culture shift there. And it also links in with some of our recommendations on EPC reform, where we think that repair and maintenance recommendations and more DIY-able type interventions as well should be incorporated into the recommendations within an EPC, because that's often the first port of call for a householder when they're looking at their home.
Look, hi there. Colin Rice. Will the knowledge base include feedback on things that haven't worked? I'm just very conscious of the history of we call it retrofit now. Used to be housing rehabilitation and things, but lots of things have been done that have been done badly, haven't they? And I think it'd be really useful to include
it's
knowledge of failures as well as successes.
It's something that's come up a few times in our conversations. It's something that, so our the chair of our board is Lynn Sullivan, and it's something that she's raised with us as well. The Knowledge Centre at the minute is very much an evolving place. So at the minute, it's the place where we're putting all of our resources that we're producing. But we've got aspirations to turn it into a much bigger library for any information you might need on retrofit that would signpost to the great work that people like AECB are doing, but also including those sorts of case studies. It's not something that we are working on as a specific project right now, but it's definitely in our minds that we should be a place where we can house that. It's a really difficult balance because we also don't want to scare people. So it's about the right target audience and how we communicate that into what different audiences as well. So yeah, it's on the long list, and we will do our best to get it prioritised.
The engineers cross organisation might be an example, a way of looking at it.
Okay.
Thank you. Julian Williams, I wonder, have you thought to tie up with the Retrofit Pattern Book? They really badly need a big boost. It's already a good resource, but the SCI values very many are uncalculated or undercalculated, and so many more details could be added.
Are you talking about the Red Co-op Retrofit Pattern Book? Or?
No, they may have fed into it.
Okay.
The Retrofit Pattern Book it's a good resource to build upon rather than build a new wheel somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. So we very much don't want to be producing information that others aren't producing. This is a library of archetypes rather than pattern books, but we had got a work stream that was looking at pattern books as well. So it's not something that we necessarily have resource ourselves to input into, but we know that people from the Retrofit Pattern Book are joining our working group, so we're linking up with our discussions. But yeah, it's a good one to be aware of.
Hi there, Rachel. Kit Knowles. So I've been working with you on this as well. So one of the things that I keep on coming back to when I'm thinking about that, obviously the distinction between archetypes, pattern books, from the archetypal side of things, we're trying to scale up, right? That's the big challenge here. We're trying to kind of group things together so we can approach it in a way that enables us to do this en masse. It's a really, really hard thing to do against all of these kind of unique aspects of buildings. And I think that one of the things that I've learned more and more in 15 years of working in this industry is that optioneering is a kind of an approach that we've been refining, and I think is so important, because obviously you have these databases of measures, all these things you've done in the past, all these things that other people, you look at them doing. And I feel like optioneering is this ability for us to test in a modeled fashion all the things that you're doing, these measures in a given specific case. And it really shocks me each and every time, if you wrap it up in embodied carbon or whole life carbon, and there's other 9 planetary boundaries, and you start thinking about these wider impacts of the decisions that you're making, having these multiple measures across the board, I don't know every time which ones are going to be right for that building. And it shocks me quite often how I'm picking different sort of sections, and it's influenced by client and brief and the heritage and whatever it might be. But I just feel like with the pattern books, for us, when we're devising these sorts of aspects, we do need to not underplay the importance of modeling. And we also, I think, should push still, where possible, where budgetarily possible, and where there is the inclination, we should be pushing those kind of individual studies. Optioneering for us is a kind of a key aspect. I wonder if that could be on our long list. I don't think we've discussed it much.
What sort of scale of project are you looking at when you're talking about optioneering?
We optioneer absolutely everything.
Like individual houses?
Yeah, from individual houses right the way through to giant event centres or whatever.
So I guess my question to you is, do you think we have time to optioneer 11 million individual homes?
No, absolutely not. But it doesn't underplay the fact that where there is the opportunity, right? And as a resource, I just feel like it does shock me, even after all this experience and hundreds of projects, where I would have made a different decision if I hadn't seen the model spit out the information telling me something else. And this idea of cumulative latency, the way we calculate whole life carbon doesn't really make quite as much sense, because it's all about when the carbon was released, not just how much carbon is released over the life. And so it's actually really difficult mentally to tie that down on the premise of understanding what is the right things to do in this specific case. It's just less experiential and more science data driven. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's very much worth saying that we see this as being like the first step of an enabling exercise to help people understand a stop, but very much needing that next step of all the expertise that you likely will bring in your projects where that modelling is taking place. So I think, it's very much not intended to replace that, but maybe to give you a bit of a head start in thinking about what you might model, I guess.
Talking about modelling again, I was just wondering if you had your favourite building physics model. Is it HPP? Is it,
I don't know if you got that when I did this presentation. I don't do the modelling. I do the strategic level stuff. That is a question for the audience, I think, rather than me.
Well, thanks. Fran Bradshaw. I was just wondering if you could say anything about change in government, and what you think might be the implications for a much bigger scale of retrofit, and particularly considering all the experiences we've all had of dealing with loads of individual owners and individual approaches, and knowing how much we need much more, holistic sort of solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great question. So what we've heard from all of our participants is that we need much more long-term government certainty. I think what's happening in Ireland, I know Matthew did a case study tour there where they've got, I think it was 10 years of policy certainty. That really helped the market. So I think that's something that our government can learn from. I'm feeling quite positive. I went to the Pepper conference on Tuesday and heard from someone from MHCLG and DESNZ. Their warm homes plan is in development. They're going to be consulting before the end of the year on minimum energy efficiency standards in the private rental sector, which I think is fundamentally needed. And we're doing some research into what else needs to go alongside that to support up the upgrade of that sector, because that's a place where there's a lot of really poorly performing homes and a lot of fuel poverty. They're going to be consulting on EPC reform by the end of the year, which I think is fundamental to all of the targets they set. But I think the contents of that warm homes plan is going to be really, really key to understanding, okay, but how long are you going to give us? Because I think that length of time and the more longer term funding schemes is going to be really important. They announced a couple of days ago I think it's Warm Homes Local Grant, which is basically a continuation of LAD. So it's good to see that they're starting to get these things moving. But yeah, until we see the real detail of the Warm Homes plan, I don't know if we'll know how much change it will make, but I'm feeling optimistic.
Hi, Jasper Mead. I'm interested in just following on from what government are thinking. How can we persuade government to have a fabric first approach? Not just put wind farms, solar farms and heat pumps in, but actually improve the housing?
It's an interesting one, this, because I did hear someone from government yesterday talk about how they have a fabric first approach. So I don't think it's something that they have decided to move away from yet. We very much take the opinion that it should be the right measures and the right solutions for the right buildings. There's been a lot of debate about fabric first, fabric fifth, and I think some of it's got a bit polarised when really we all just need to be thinking about what's right for the building specifically. how can we convince government that that's the right way forward? I don't think that they don't think it's the right way forward, particularly when you're talking to the civil servant level. But yeah, it's something that we need to keep enforcing because it's the fundamental link to our health and well-being, right? That's the thing that we need to keep talking about, that if we were to just decarbonise our energy sources, if we were to just use heat pumps, A, we'd have a massive issue with our grid, but B, we're not going to be tackling all of the known health impacts associated with our poorly performing homes. So I think that message is really key for us to keep talking about.
Yeah, the action looks like it is energy first, not fabric first.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that is fair enough. So I think, yeah, there's more to be done there on the importance of that, the health side.
Hello, Jack Allen. I would say that actually I used to be a big fan of fabric first, but I'd say probably second is best because there's a lot of quick wins that you can put in, which are much cheaper with much better paybacks. Would you agree with that? And then look at fabric when it's at the end of life, sort of, or at the renovation stage.
Yeah, so I think I'm very much in favour of the idea of considering a building's life and taking the most opportunity from trigger points that happen. So when you're doing an extension, when you're replacing your kitchen, having a plan for when your boiler is going to need to be replaced. I think that's the way that we're going to get most householders on board. Totally agree that repair is the first thing that we need to do, replacing our blown double glazing windows. I've got 3 in my house that I need to put on my to-do list. But yeah, I agree. I think that getting across those easy wins is really important. And some people will be able to afford and have the motivation to do this quicker, and some need the longer term plan. So I think it's allowing for both sort of strategies.
Yeah, I think sometimes with local authorities, they don't want to do the easy wins because it gets it above a C and then they can't get funding, whereas they could put those easy wins in and save a lot of carbon for a lot less money. So that seems to be one of my issues with the fabric first.
You know, that's a really interesting insight, which I had not heard before. So yes, good to know.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Really appreciate that.